Hello and welcome to our session called Does How We Fund Research with Societal Goals Work? This is a 1-hour session today as part of the STI conference, and we are very happy to welcome 3 speakers. We have Thomas Bjørnholm, the Executive Chief Scientific Officer of the Bjørnholm Fund, part of the Velux Foundations, Svein Olaf Nås, Special Advisor, Research Council of Norway, and Maria Nedeva, who's professor at the University of Manchester and the University of Lund in Sweden. We will also have Carter Bloch, who's professor and center director of CFA, who will give a few reflections on a project that we are doing at the moment, funded by the Novo Nordisk Foundation, a 4-year academic project, which is what sort of inspired this session. So I would just like to say a few words about the theme, and then for 5 to 10 minutes, and then we will go through in alphabetical order the speakers on the screen, and they will give their thoughts and reflections on this question of does how we fund research with societal goals work. So firstly, I wanted to say a little bit about societal. So in our understanding, funding of research with societal goals can be talking about local societal issues, issues at a national scale, or even kind of global level societal challenges, sometimes referred to as various sort of science, technology, and innovation missions and beyond, including co-creation with stakeholders and all sorts of different forms of engagement in academic research and funding different kinds of networks of interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary collaborators. So I will now go through just a few sort of framing thoughts about this topic before in turn handing to our speakers today in the panel. So the context as we see it for this particular question, from research that we're doing and from research that's been done in other fields, is that research funding in many research fields across global science can now be very complicated, and the funding that researchers are using can be quite mixed. So this can be both in terms of the aims and objectives that funding is trying to achieve to get kind of different kinds of research, can be quite hybrid or mixed. So we're not just talking about excellence funding or mission funding or funding with societal properties, but there can be quite a mixture of aims and objectives, time horizons, and so on that funding is addressing for research to try and come through. At the same time, with certainly with the pandemic in the past 2 years and various things like climate change crisis and so on, we are seeing an increasing priority given to enabling research with societal goals. So this can be research directly on those themes, but also allowing for flexibility in the research funding system to give sort of resilience and flexibility for research already underway to address urgent priorities, such I believe has been addressed in other sessions on the conference, where COVID has been addressed as a research object, even when not explicitly funded originally in research. So the main focus of this session is really about how far should funders go to support societal goals in research. So this could be in the program design with ministries and politicians, and in the policy process in early stages of how funding instruments are designed, in funding calls, steering of the ambitions and proposals by researchers and research collaborations and consortia at the stage of proposals being then agreed, actually participating through being on part of the team in funded projects and parts of advisory boards and other structures, more engaged monitoring and enforcement even of the kind of goals that have been agreed in funding, and then aspects such as coordinating and harmonizing and developing strategies with other funders when coordinating and synergy of efforts across funders can help research deliver more for the same amount of money. And then to sort of position ourselves a bit against the opening keynote of the STI conference this year, is the best approach actually just to leave science to itself, to self-organize, with the argument that kind of academic or scientific freedom will deliver the best outcomes. So the speakers that we have today sort of cover different aspects of this spectrum. We have an academic researcher and we have 2 funders of different kinds, one a public funder, another foundation funder. So I'm looking forward to their comments on this. I just wanted to introduce one idea from a project we have ongoing, which is looking at the kind of funders and researchers as kind of involved in a dynamic relationship really of strategies and slides. If you could just mute your microphone a moment, thank you. Stemming from sort of funding policies and programs all the way through to kind of calls for proposals, agreements of research that will be undertaken, and then the research that researchers finally do as they adjust to kind of scientific and practical problems along the way in doing their research. And this is just an idea of a kind of schematic of how we understand this process. And the reason I wanted to introduce it just before closing is that we see a lot of researchers, certainly in two fields we're studying, in Denmark, Netherlands, and Norway, in a current project across food sciences and renewable energy research, which are, heavy societal focus areas, as being involved in many of these relationships at once. So they're funded by multiple funders, and they're essentially in this kind of dynamic position of strategies and responses in what funders expect and what researchers do, and how that's sort of checked over time with multiple funders. So we just wonder if there is kind of opportunities here for synergy and planning and coordination across funders, as well as maybe a deeper understanding of how researchers are actually currently working and the funding conditions that they face. So with those kind of opening remarks, I'll go back to the slide that just has a few suggested questions here. And then I would like to hand the floor to Thomas Bjørnholm, who's Executive Chief Scientific Officer of the Willem Fund. And I will mute my microphone and pass to Thomas now.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for asking me to contribute to this very interesting discussion. I'm representing one of the big private foundations in Denmark that support research. It's the Bloch group. We basically try to give back all the money made on selling rooftop windows back to the Danish society every year. And one main stream of fund is to support research at the Danish universities. But before I come back to how we try to weave that into mission-driven or challenge-driven topics, I'll give a little bit of the background. The Willem Foundation is founded by Willem Kjær Rasmussen 50 years ago, and the family that has now is the third generation of this family. They have taken a genuine and serious interest in climate issues for many decades, and the way that topic has been dealt with by the foundations is typically by supporting UN, making new types of structures that could support NGOs or think tanks, influence the political decisions, the economical models, things like that. So that's sort of a lot of direct funds to try to mitigate and understand better climate change. But it's sort of separated in the way the foundation works from the sort of research per se flow of funds that I represent. So there's a lot of interest, a lot of money going into the question of the climate and the globe and the resources, but it's not flowing directly through the sort of standard research channels, which are the ones I represent are very ERC-like. We like to support technical and natural science and support the researchers' own ideas. And so one of the items on the slide was not to do anything at all. I think maybe it's the last bullet on the slide you can see. And so in a way, that's the philosophy we follow in terms of research. We want to support the researchers themselves, allow their own ideas to flourish, and just make a very transparent check of the quality by having open competition and make the researchers basically battle against each other on the best ideas. As long as it's broadly within technical and natural sciences, we are field agnostics. We don't have a filter that climate or any other topic is given priority. It's just simply the best idea. So the interesting exercise is to then go to the portfolio of active grants, we have about 3 billion Danish kroner. That's about 300 million pounds in active grants. It's quite a substantial part of the third-party grants at Danish universities in technical and natural sciences, about 20%. And then we look at that portfolio and we see how much of that is actually dealing with climate and energy research. And it turns out to be 25%, but that's 25% selected on the excellence criterion alone. But the researchers have been inspired by these grand challenges and missions and so on. And they have by themselves been driven into that field, and that's where they want to be innovative. So that's one key point, that even though you don't have a sign on the door, climate and energy research, you still catch a lot. If it's a real interesting challenge, global challenge, it will inspire researchers, without you doing much. Maybe it's even more interesting to ask the question of this portfolio of active grants. If we look sort of 5-10 years back, which project has contributed most to mitigating climate change? And it turns out to be a project from a theoretical mathematician doing data computer science. He has invented or devised a new theory that allows the information in this, in the computer's cloud to, be handled much more efficiently. And he published that paper quite recently, and sort of the precursors of that paper some years ago. And one of the big server companies, Vimeo, they wrote to him a nice letter saying, "Oh, thank you for publishing this code. We implemented and we saved 90% of the electricity for our servers, because now we are moving information back and forth much more efficiently." And you probably all know that the cloud is a climate. It emits CO2 on the level of all the total air traffic in the world. So it's a very big contribution. If you can save electricity for the cloud, then you can also mitigate climate change. So the point is, if we had a sign on the door, we give priority to excellent applications with a climate or energy inclination, we would never have supported this particular project, even though when we look in hindsight, that seems to be the one that has contributed the most significantly by being completely out of the box and surprising. So it's sort of, I think the bottom line for me, this foundation is, there's a lot you can do by direct supporting everybody who works on a grand challenge. In our case, it's climate and energy agendas, and we support that directly through sort of non-research, but think tanks, a lot of knowledge-based things, but not research as we understand it in sort of the university setting. And then we have a portfolio of research grants, which are selected by excellence only, and lo and behold, they actually deal a lot with exactly that question all by themselves. And even those who don't know they're dealing with it, they contribute a lot to the question of climate and energy change. So it's a tricky business. It's really difficult to pick the winner, and you sort of have to balance. I think the sort of the boring answer is you have to have put a lot of bets on a lot of horses, and don't forget a big bet on blue sky research, because probably, most likely, we don't even know today what the solutions 10, 20 years down the road will be, and we have to keep an eye on that and support that. So that's my contribution.
Thank you, Thomas. That's a very interesting and sort of based and I guess provocative view on some of the approaches to funding we've seen in recent years. This kind of balance of funding think tank and so on, and then the open-ended research that still ends up having significant impact. So that's very fascinating. Now we'll move to Svein Olaf, who's Special Advisor at the Research Council of Norway, for his comments on this theme.
Thank you very much, Duncan. Hello, everybody, and thank you for inviting me. It was interesting also now to listen to Thomas's presentation. As you introduced me, I'm an advisor to the Research Council and not the decision maker, so I may end up saying something that my boss would not agree with, but it's for the sake of the discussion, I think. My work is actually more to sponsor people like yourself, people working on trying to understand how the research and innovation system works. When it comes to the Research Council in Norway, we only have one council in Norway covering all fields of science and all types of science. That means both basic funding and thematic or competitive funding. I think it is important within such a broad scope that we differentiate between different types of support that we operate, and we should not put the one up against the other so directly. Part of solving big problems is to have fully open academic freedom for people to do work the way they would like to do it. That is partly financed via basic funding and partly funded via open, free calls for people to apply. The other part is the more thematic and oriented types of funding that we do. And in those cases, we are not picking winners, but we are picking themes or problems that we would like to address. And I think that is fair. So in those cases, it is up to the researchers or those who do the work to decide how to try to come up with a solution. But it is us, as representing the public interest, that actually decides what types of problems that are of interest to solve. Something I think is very fair. Yes. Part of the problem, of course, is that research is not the only thing. In order to solve problems, we need a lot of inputs and cooperation and coordination across sectors and policy fields, etc. And that is not part of our authority. So that causes a lot of problems because we can only actually finance research. And personally, I think we have too little discussion about all the different things that needs to be taken care of in order to solve the difficult issues that we face. And for instance, Norway being a very small country with quite big resources, but still a small country, one should expect that it is very easy to coordinate, to agree with other agencies, ministries, authorities, etc. But this turns out to be difficult, and I think our understanding of all that it takes to solve problems and come up with real innovative solutions is not good enough, and this is something that we should work hard to improve on. In particular, I think also a research council like my own should actually speak out to the other agencies and authorities and say what we think they should do in order for us to together be able to solve problems. Earlier today, we have also been discussing what is high quality or good research, exemplified with bibliometric studies and challenges with those. These days, and of course, having the better quality or as high quality as possible is always something that we want. But it is not necessarily the only goal. And from my point of view, I would say it is better to have good research targeting the problem we have than excellent research targeting a different problem. It may end up solving something which is important, but if we have a really important problem, then we should actually make sure that we address that problem. Deciding what is good quality ex ante is actually quite difficult. And in the Research Council, we receive a huge number of applications for projects. So huge that, and people are now so good at writing proposals that most of them get very high. They get evaluated as very, very good project, and it results in a selection process where it is very difficult to distinguish between the best. And you may even say that rolling a dice could be an equally good way of dealing with it when it comes to the top level of the projects. And when we have funds to finance only between 10 and 20% of the applications, of course, all of those are very, very good ones that could have been selected. And since the number of projects are so huge, we need some efficient ways of dealing with it. And that applies to both how we select the experts and how the experts are actually able to judge whether the consortia and the projects themselves are good enough. And although we want them to read the proposals and relate to them, they tend to utilize a lot of bibliometrics in order to help themselves in their work. And this is challenging, I think, with the type of bibliometrics that we have. Okay, I think I'll leave it there because there are so many different and difficult challenges dealing with these things, and I think we need to keep developing the way we do policy much more. Thanks so far.
Very much, Svein Olaf. So that was thank you, Svein Olaf. That was a very interesting, contrasting perspective to Thomas there, and a lot of challenges that you're facing within this funder, especially given its broad remit and so on, as you say, in spite of the sort of small country but big resources. Now we will hand to Professor Maria Nedeva at the University of Manchester for her comments and input on this theme.
Hello all, and thank you for having me at this panel. There is a delay with everything, so my face may be saying different things from what you hear. It's not me, it's the cameras. Anyway, so I am a university professor and I've been studying how science works and science dynamics for a couple of decades, if not longer, but I'm not owning up to that, right? So I can't bring to the table the wonderfully nuanced and rich practical perspectives that my colleagues on the panel brought. But what I thought I'm going to try and do is I would like to suggest some provocative kind of ideas so we can start debate. How do we start answering some of the questions that are on this slide that you can all see? Because from the point of view of our current understanding and comprehension, we can't actually answer most of them. Now, as Duncan already pointed out, the issue is that all this societal goal-oriented funding is, yes, it does work, but it works only as a part of a very well constituted research funding portfolio, right? And our task as an analyst of policy issues and issues of research funding and governance is to find our way through this mix. Now, what I'm going to suggest is broadly we can see the kind of knowledge part of the science system as consisting of two different parts. One of these parts consists of the people, scientists and scholars with their competencies, which take many, many years and decades to develop. The networks of these people at local and global level. It includes equipment and facilities and different kind of types of infrastructure to facilitate knowledge-based processes. And last but not least, it includes bodies of knowledge which actually contain different kinds of knowledge. Some of it is understanding kind of knowledge, like theories and notions, frameworks. Others is methodologies, empirical parts of knowledge. But basically, the important thing is that this kind of part of knowledge processes, it's not an accident that it is usually referred to in the literature as the knowledge base. Right, because it is, these are the relatively immutable parts of science and research. And they change, but they change kind of relatively slowly. They change into as a revolutionary or evolutionary processes, which we have studied. But there is another part which always consists of problems. And these problems can be specific to progressing the knowledge, or they can relate to societal goals and practical problems. The important thing about this layer, though, is that this is the very dynamic layer, and this kind of goals of science, which can be changed, of course, through funding, because funding is the thing that moves the cheese for us scholars and scientists. These goals reflect how we manifest problems in very specific situations. And this changes. So our problems change very quickly, even the way in which we perceive grand challenges like climate change. Until recently, for example, a lot of the people in the United States at political levels completely refuted this kind of processes while suffering from them, weirdly. So just as an example, how this works. I don't know whether many of you realize that in, I think, 1973, research proposals to the Medical Research Council in the UK by the guy who developed the in vitro fertilization method was rejected. And I've looked at this proposal because I could, right? And it was very interesting because there were two reasons this proposal was rejected. And the first one was that fertility, increasing fertility is not a problem. Overpopulation is the problem, right? And then it turns out that actually our fertility is a problem. Now, as it happens, this proposal didn't get funded by public funding, so these people raised private funds. Mind you, the second reason was that the principal investigator is too old, but I don't even want to start discussing that. But you see how the perception of what is the problem can change dramatically. And more recent example is actually the COVID pandemic, because when the basic research behind the mRNA vaccines was carried out, nobody expected that 34 years later, this will be used to deal with the kind of new plague. But you get the reason, the reasoning behind this. So where is the question, the real question, I believe? We have to ask ourselves, who has the primary responsibility? What kind of funders, what type of funding has the primary responsibility to support these two parts of knowledge processes, the kind of fundamentals, the science base, and the more problem-oriented kind of funding. And it seems to me that actually public funders should give priority to maintaining the science base, which again lets me raise with you another issue. We need probably to start very seriously reconsidering the role of different kinds of funders in the whole mix, and particularly the role of private foundations. Because a lot of, for example, medical research is funded by private foundations. nowadays. It's not funded by so much public funding. But anyway, these are the things I believe we should revisit if we want to tackle these questions in an interesting and productive way, because at the moment, asking what proportion of funding can be allocated in what way through problems and grand challenges or through kind of much more blue sky research probably are questions that we're not able to answer. And I would like to end by getting back to what Thomas mentioned, that actually probably one of the keys is not to get bogged down trying to answer this question, but to keep our funding arrangements sufficiently flexible and broad so that we actually are prepared for black swans like this theoretical mathematician proved in the program. Thank you very much.
Maria, so we've had a very interesting perspective from a foundation, from a unified research council in Norway, and now a perspective of maintaining healthy mixes of funders. I'd just like to briefly hand then to Carter Bloch here, Professor and Centre Director at CFA here at Aarhus University. And while Carter is just saying a few more words on this theme, please feel free to put your questions in the question chat part of the session, and then we can come to those in a few moments, as well as the panel speakers are free to address questions to each other. So Carter, would you like to say a few words?
Thank you. Well, as Duncan mentioned, I'm together with Duncan and Irene and a few others on the PROSCON project, which is funded by the Novo Nordisk Foundation and looks precisely at these issues of how or in what ways funding can best promote societal impact, and we look at it both from a, say, the viewpoint of the funder and a viewpoint of the researcher. Where I think a lot of the discussion that we've been hearing now has been very interesting. Is kind of from the funder perspective. But one of these things we've also seen from, at least so far in terms of the work, is that a lot of researchers are involved in a lot of different types of funding, and have to navigate between that, and are inevitably influenced by the different types of funding they've had, whether it's simultaneously or beforehand, and that there's a lot of things going on there that could be interesting to take into account, or at least raises the questions of whether that should be taken into account. That we're not really able to look at the effects of one grant on its own. But I just wanted to, I thought these presentations were very interesting. I wanted to maybe pose a couple questions just to get discussion started to build on these. One thing, if you look at terms of funding, and there was some discussion on terms of there's different types of grants, different types of funding and whatnot, but it's still, in a lot of ways, you could see it as a full system. And there's this question of whether the whole funding system really is best served by being able to kind of cover each of the individual stages, whether it's looking at funding, at research that's completely on the basis of the researcher's own ideas, or if it's within a theme, if it's further along down the value chain, you could say. Also, in terms of and also looking in particular towards Thomas and Maria's comments, was if we look at in terms of the different types of, and I think the example that Thomas gave was a very interesting example of a research project that was completely based on own interest, but then actually ended up having an impact. But if you look in terms of research funding and whether some sort of open calls and open competition could allow all sorts of different types of funding that really looks in a lot of different ways where you're not really looking towards impact, but it ends up mattering, or things that are really societally targeted. I think that one issue is that all the funding is very, very competitive. So whatever criteria you put on, you'd expect that researchers will try to focus on that criteria as much as possible. So even if you had someone that really was interested in taking their research and moving it forward to make it more applicable, and maybe was interested in engaging with a lot of other different types of actors, that they're only really going to pitch that type of idea if it's something that really fits well with the funding instrument. So my question, I think, for Thomas, in terms of, Willem is one player in the system, and it doesn't necessarily need to be your own. But where do you feel that that the open funding is it enough to really kind of allow for the different types of research that kind of pushes research towards, let's say, climate goals? Is there anything missing in terms of the chain of different types of research to be applicable that would be better served for something that was more thematic and was more targeted, in addition to what you were talking about in terms of open competitions? Is there still a need for both? In terms of, should funders focus on a science-based, and where Thomas had an example of companies that went in, took a result, and they implemented it themselves. But there may be a lot of other cases where that transfer of research, really, where there's an important role for the researcher, and also in collaboration with is that part of maintaining the science base in terms of funders, or is it something that we rely basically on the unexpected and the researchers to kind of create what they think is best? That was a question I posed for now. Thanks.
Do you want me to answer?
Please.
Thank you for that question. It's a really tough question, because we all like, and especially politicians, the public, it's intuitive for us to say, well, if we have a problem, let's fix it. And it's so abstract that we don't know the solution. And if we don't know the solution, what do we do? And I think the answer to that is the same as the answer is for bio. Why are we so interested in biodiversity? Why is there a biodiversity crisis? Because the biodiversity is our a way for nature to prepare itself for any unexpected changes. So if you have a large diversity of species, then you can, if it gets hotter or warmer or drier or anything, then there will always be somebody who will flourish and others that will die. But if you have diversity, it will still continue. And I think it's the same. We have to stick with that for ideas. We have to have diversity in ideas, because we don't know which of the ideas we are propagating right now will be important in the future. And I think the COVID crisis is an extremely good example of that. Here in Denmark, we had, I think that's at least what we say ourselves, we became the world leaders in fast gene sequencing new mutations of COVID. And that was basically due to a group in Aalborg who had been sort of nerding with top-level research, but curiosity-driven research, gene sequencing bacteria in wastewater for a decade, and suddenly that technique and that knowledge was world leading in terms of being applied to the COVID crisis, and so that is an example. It was there, and then the important thing is that the university was able to activate it. So basically, the whole lab threw everything they had in their hands, and they spent the last 1.5 years sequencing COVID mutants instead, and provided an important piece to mitigating the spread of COVID here. So, and the same is true for many of the other aspects of the vaccine and so on. So, that's all things that are building on knowledge that is built up over many years and decades. and there's really no simple answer. I think still it's. I think as our Norwegian friend also said, of course we have to be able to face and discuss the challenges that we have, the climate or food or health issues, and I think that discussion is extremely important, but it should be conducted at a sort of more aggregated or higher level. So a university, I think it's fantastic if a university as an institution says we need to make a contribution to a global challenge, and then install a sense of urgency and a conscience in their students and researchers that this is an important problem that can inspire you. And then there's this magic gray zone where the students and researchers, they are inspired, but they are not driven into a track where you are basically losing innovation and you're losing all the step changes. So it's this balance between expressing the global challenges also as an institution, but at a sufficiently high level that it doesn't disturb or collapse the diversity of ideas in a good university among the great scientists and students, and sort of collapse them into trivial solutions. That's the key, and the whole innovation ecosystem that basically drives curiosity-driven ideas through patents and companies and end up in real solutions. I mean, like the vaccine, those were ideas that were generated and grew over the last decades, and now there are companies developing them and building on that. And we just have to be very clear that that's the system that works, and I don't know of any other system that works. And we have to, in all our countries, try to connect the university research and the step change, curiosity-driven research with applications in a very sort of multi-dimensional way, where ideas float around and investors and all these different ingredients that are needed to actually catch the relevant idea once they are relevant and develop them into important applications.
Thank you, Thomas. Svein Olaf or Maria, would you like to come in on this point?
Yeah, I don't think we really disagree, because it is obviously so that we need to have a knowledge base and keep developing it and to be able to draw upon it. But if we could put it the other way and say, if all research we did was only curiosity driven and basic research, etc., without having a view to the real problems that we face, it would probably not be a good situation either. I think the COVID-19 crisis is a good example of a situation where we have general and high quality medical research going on over time. But unless we did the big lifting of directing lots of resources in the direction of solving the concrete problem that we were facing, we would not have solved it. So also the directed research was extremely necessary in that case. I think it's also interesting to notice that happened without actually very much competition for research grants. We think very often that the only way of having high quality is to have competition for it. Personally, I think this is a waste of resources in many cases, and that we should have other ways of selecting or directing the best research. But we have to set a direction when it comes to what types of problems we need to solve. And at present, in addition to the pandemic, of course, the environmental crisis and the climate change, etc., it is a dramatic thing, and we need to tap into all the good knowledge bases that we have. But we also need to involve all those that are needed to solve these problems. And those are stakeholders at all levels and all types of businesses and authorities and public services that are needed in order to really come up with good solutions. Okay.
Hey. may I come in? Duncan?
Please comment. I'm not sure if my microphone is lagging. Yes, please feel free to comment.
Right. Several things. First thing is that, of course, I was kind of very impressed with Thomas's statement about diversity, because that is what I was trying to bring to the table as well. But the issue is that my feeling is that private foundations and public funders see this very differently. Because, for example, what we hear in the UK, which of course we're a very capitalist kind of research system, is that this is taxpayers' money and there has to be some benefit to all that. As a result of that, and let's go with the COVID example again, the interesting thing is that a member of my research team looked at sources of funding for the labs that developed the vaccines in the last 10 to 15 years. And the interesting thing is that a relatively small proportion of this funding for the labs who developed the vaccine came from public funding. And the reason for that is that the knowledge trajectory to develop the vaccines over a weekend is very long, but it was about viruses that are not our problem, right? So that is kind of the thing about directing it to problems. So if these labs didn't manage to do the background research on the medical stuff that is not our problem over the 15, 20 years previously, based on private foundations' money, we wouldn't have been able to solve the immediate problem of COVID. As an example, one of the labs that was key to developing the AstraZeneca vaccine, the background is research on a virus that affects camel herders in Mongolia, and it also affects sugarcane cutters in kind of Latin American and Asian countries as well, because apparently they got the virus from bats, but it never crossed from human to human. That was the difference with the COVID. So basically the bats will go drink sugar from the sugarcane, the cutters will drink sugar from the sugarcane, they get it. So this is what these people worked on. But you see, the British government and establishment and the Research Council always thought that this is not our problem. So why do we fund it? And I find this absolutely fascinating in terms of exactly this thing, how problems change. Something that is completely not our problem can become our problem. By the way, another strand of research was on Ebola, which also happens not to be our problem, thank God.
Thank you, Maria. I just wanted to pose a question from the research we're doing, actually, which is, we're making, or we see certain patterns, or we make assumptions about how certain kinds of funding are associated with certain kinds of publications or societal outcomes, as we're discussing here. One of the challenges we're facing is actually, how do we even know what funding researchers have across global science to know how funders are supporting research with societal goals? In specific instances for certain single funders, we may know, such as the Research Council of Norway has a very comprehensive database. The Bjørnholm Fund may be the same. But in many cases, researchers themselves don't necessarily disclose this for a variety of reasons. The way that they acknowledge funding in papers is not always attributable or complete. And this can really hamper studies as well of how funding is actually underpinning these various kind of societal challenges that we see. So I just wanted to kind of put that out there as whether there's anything funders can do alone or coordinating with others about these kind of things to enable us to build knowledge about how these dynamics are unfolding. So if anyone would like to comment on that or what Maria said, please feel free, out of Thomas, Svein Olaf, Carter.
If I may, we try to keep track of what types of challenges that researchers go for and where the funding is. But of course, we have the problem of greenwashing, and that can happen with any kind of theme or thematic direction. And how to deal with that is extremely difficult, I think. So I don't see an obvious solution to that. We should also keep in mind, of course, that there are very different situations in different countries. In the Norwegian case, we have, I think, a decent balance between basic funding and competitive funding, but in other countries that may be very, very different. And that so the feeling of having the academic freedom that is necessary is, of course, very different in those cases. Thanks.
There's actually a question for you, Svein Olaf, that's come up in the question box. I'll just read it as it's written. It says, are you suggesting that political initiatives for societal transformation, for instance, in the traffic or building sector as examples, cannot be started from the research system, so that the political action coalition needs to be much broader to get those things going?
Yes, that's the easy. But it could be started or initiated from the research system, but it is necessary to involve other partners. It could also be initiated other places in the system. It doesn't need to be initiated in research as such. It is, in that case, is a very old-fashioned way of thinking, I think. I hope that was a response.
Looking if we have any other questions. We have a few minutes remaining. And please feel free, Thomas, Carter, or Maria, to say any further comments on these issues.
Well, I have one comment, sort of to get the full spectrum. I mean, let's assume that a big foundation, global foundation, gets a really bad idea. Like, I think we've seen examples of geoengineering, where certain aspects of geoengineering, even though it's sympathetic, you can be very sympathetic that you can spray ashes on the clouds and reflect the sun back and mitigate temperature rise that way. Things like that. You know, if just as an example, if you as a funder say, we think that's really that's an interesting thing to investigate, and you start putting money there, people will start investigating it, and you are basically defocusing the whole agenda, and so you can do a lot of damage if you pick the wrong winner. And so picking the winner is not a free lunch. If you're too specific about what you think is the winner, you know, it's really a very risky business, and it can be damaging to actually creating the better, more stable solution. So often you talk about it as if it's sort of a neutral thing, and of course we try to pick the winner, but we, you know, you should be aware that you can do a lot of damage if you pick the wrong one.
That perspective. We have about 5 minutes remaining. If the other panelists would like to make any further comments, or if anyone wishes to ask any further questions, you're welcome to before we close.
I wanted to point out, I think that I mean, there's definitely examples where we're being too prescriptive in policies, or picking the winners as Thomas mentioned, has had adverse consequences. But I think there's still a range between there where we can still leave it open in terms of how the solution is going to be done, and that they can be a good way to create a platform where a lot of this type of work that kind of attempts to go further with the research can be good. I mean, some of the groups that we're looking at in the project, they've got all sorts of different stuff. They're doing open research, and that's pretty much where they've kind of started, but they're very much interested in going forward with some of it. And in some cases, perhaps they can get a collaboration with a company, then that's just as it is. But in other cases, they really are, to a large extent, they're doing the work that they can get funded. And if they don't have avenues to kind of facilitate, collaborating and doing work that's a little bit more applied and that's furthering, that still is uncertain and has risk and things that may not be easy to sell with the basic call that's completely based on researchers' own ideas. And I think that there's a room for that, and it's something that would be, there'd be a gap in the system for a lot of things that really, it's hard to take it from the research that's being done and what a lot of businesses can do. And there are, of course, differences across different sectors where we've got, like, for example, biomedicine, the medical sector. There's a lot of companies with incredible research capacity, where some other industries you really have a bigger gap that really can be filled by potentially facilitated with the funding. I think there's another question here. Should I take it, Duncan, or do you want to?
If you can, Carter, yes.
The question is just posed openly: is picking the right one versus the wrong one often a matter of choosing to finance teams who have already been funded before? I guess that's a question in terms of the subjective looking, guessing whether it's right or wrong is looking at whether the group's past success. I'm assuming that's the question, if that's often the case.
I don't know. I can try to answer that. I mean, there's a lot of talk about Matthäus effects, that if you have a lot, then you get more, and maybe it's the step changes and real innovative ideas may come from other sides. So as a foundation, I think it's part of our obligation to make sure that we are not driven by past performance, but real ingenuity in the ideas. And at least I can say from our foundation, that's something we try to be very careful about, and we even have an instrument where you can apply anonymously, so that you can't see whether this person or group has been funded before, or even who they are. So you try to judge the ideas on their novelty alone. So again, we're trying to sort of be diverse. We have sort of traditional funding schemes, but we also have very untraditional funding schemes to try to catch all the good ideas that are generated in the university system.
Thank you for that input. Now we have just a few moments remaining. If anyone would like to pose any final questions or make any final comments, and then I will wrap up the session in a few moments. Okay, there's a question here which I think is worth posing before we close. It's actually by Svein Olaf. Okay, he's talking about big companies have big power. So they may not just be steered by the market, but by public authority. Yeah. Okay. Okay, yeah.
There isn't anything else, then I would like to pose a question to Svein Olaf, who's at an organization that really kind of covers the whole spectrum. To what extent, and I think you talked about this a little bit, is to what extent is there coordination, just within the council between the different areas where you've got some programs that are completely open, independent research, where others are really very thematic, and then also have some requirements in terms of engagement with other stakeholders. How much coordination or thinking is there in between the different types, or is it basically each are kind of put together individually or independently?
It is a little bit of coordination. So being one council helps a lot. But still, they were, before being unified, those were different organizations, and it is really difficult to coordinate even within one council like we are. And my argument has all the way been that we need to coordinate with a lot of other actions in order to solve the big problems, and that is even harder. So this is something we need to work very hard to solve, I think.
Thank you, Svein Olaf. I think we're now at time, so I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our panelists today, our speakers, Svein Olaf, Thomas, and Maria, and Carter, and to thank you all for joining us in this session and for posing questions. And yes, we hope you enjoy the rest of the STI conference. So thank you for joining us, and I will be stopping the session now. Thank you.